So, folks, I'm going to start this segment off, if I may, with a clip from an interview that Noam Chomsky did like 30 years ago. And it's an interview he did with Andrew Marr. And it's a talk he gave about propaganda. And it's full of many of the famous quotes you may know come from Noam Chomsky. But I want to watch like a portion of this largely because I think that there is, well, I think there is some applications to our current time. Let's take a look.
By listening to explain what the propaganda model, as you call it, is. For many people, the idea that propaganda is used by democratic rather than merely authoritarian governments will be a strange one.
Well, the term propaganda fell into disfavor at around the Second World War, but in the 1920s and the 1930s, it was commonly used and, in fact, advocated, not by leading intellectuals, by the founders of modern political science, by Wilsonian progressives, and, of course, by the public relations industry, as a necessary technique to overcome the danger of democracy. The institutional structure of the media is quite straightforward. We're talking about the United States, but it's not very different elsewhere. The major, there are sectors, but the agenda-setting media, the ones that sort of set the framework for everyone else, like the New York Times and the Washington Post and so on, these are major corporations, parts of even bigger conglomerates. Like other corporate institutions, they have a product and a market. Their market is advertisers, that is, other businesses. Their product is relatively privileged audiences, more or less.
So they're selling audiences to
They're selling privileged audience. These are big corporations selling privileged audiences to other corporations. Now the question is, what picture of the world would a rational person expect to come out of this structure? And then we draw some conclusions about what you'd expect, and then we check, and yes, that's the picture of the world that comes out.
And is this anything more than the idea that basically the press is relatively right-wing, with some exceptions, because it's owned by big business, which is a truism, is well known?
Well, I would call the press relatively liberal. Here I agree with the right-wing critics. So especially the New York Times and the Washington Post, which are called, without a trace of irony, the New York Times is called the establishment left in, say, major foreign policy journals. And that's correct, but what's not recognized is that the role of the liberal intellectual establishment is to set very sharp bounds on how far you can go. This far and no further.
Give me some...
And I think that, like, he's about to go on and give examples, but, like, this is still all true. All of this is still true to this day. Okay? And I feel like you can see this especially around Gaza. Especially around Gaza. An example that I'll pull up here real quick is an article from the New York Times, actually, that ran just a handful of days ago, about a week ago. I fought in Gaza, here is why I would not go back. And it's a guest essay from a reserve captain in the IDF. And it's basically like, oh, yep, I wouldn't go back there. We were getting embroiled in a forever war, and it wasn't good, and there was a lot of lies. And, you know, I mean, it is broadening the acceptable window for what the generally liberal readership of the New York Times is ready to accept about this particular event, but it's still not the correct analysis of what is happening, right? It's still not, there's a genocide happening. And I think that is important to keep in mind. And I know that I said this might be good news before we started the segment. We're going to get there, but I think it's important to understand the dynamic that is at play here.
Some examples of that.
Well, let's take, say, the Vietnam War. Probably the leading critic, and in fact one of the leading dissident intellectuals in the mainstream, is Anthony Lewis of the New York Times, who did finally come around to opposing the Vietnam War about 1969, about a year and a half after corporate America had more or less ordered Washington to call it off. And his picture from then on is that the war, as he put it, began with blundering efforts to do good, But it ended up, by 1969, being a disaster and costing us too much.
So what would
the criticism.
What would the non-propaganda model have told Americans about the Vietnam War at the same time?
Same thing that the mainstream press was telling them about Afghanistan. The United States invaded first of all, in the 1950s, it set up a standard Latin American-style terror state, which had massacred tens of thousands of people, but was unable to control a local uprising, and everyone knows, at least every specialist knows that's what it was. And when Kennedy came in 1961, they had to make a decision because the government was collapsing under local attack. So the U.S. just invaded the country. In 1961, the U.S. Air Force started bombing South Vietnamese civilians, authorized napalm, crop destruction. Then in 1965, February 1965, the next major escalation took place against South Vietnam, not against North Vietnam. That was a sideshow. That's what an honest press would be saying, but you can't find a trace of it.
Now, if the press is a censoring organization, tell me how that works. You're not suggesting that proprietors phone one another up, or that many journalists get their copy spiked, as we say?
And I think that this is, again, very relevant to our current time, right? And like this journalist, he's basically like, are you saying that like the boss calls and says this is how it has to be, if not you're fired? Like, is that how it is?
It's actually Orwell, you may recall, has an essay called Literary Censorship in England, which was supposed to be the introduction to Animal Farm, except that it never appeared, in which he points out, look, I'm writing about a totalitarian society, but in free democratic England it's not all that different. And then he says unpopular ideas can be silenced without any force. And then he gives a two-sentence response, which is not very profound, but captures it. He says two reasons. First, the press is owned by wealthy men who have every interest in not having certain things appear. But second, the whole educational system, from the beginning on through, just gets you to understand that there are certain things you just don't say. Well, spelling these things out, that's perfectly correct. I mean, it's the first sentence is what we expand.
This is what I don't get, because it suggests that, I mean, I'm a journalist, people like me are self-censoring.
No, not self-censoring. There's a filtering system that starts in kindergarten. It goes all the way through. And it doesn't work 100%, but it's pretty effective. It selects for obedience and subordination. And especially, I think that
so stroppy people won't make it to positions of influence.
Behavior problems, or if you read applications to a graduate school, you see that people will tell you he's not doesn't get along too well with his colleagues. You know how to interpret those things.
I'm just interested in this because I was brought up, like a lot of people, probably post the Watergate film and so on, to believe that journalism was a crusading craft and that there were a lot of disputatious, stroppy, difficult people in journalism. And I have to say, I think I know some of them.
Well, I know some of the best and best-known investigative reporters in the United States. I won't mention names because I don't want to, whose attitude toward the media is much more cynical than mine. In fact, they regard the media as a sham, and they know and they consciously talk about how they try to play it like a violin. If they see a little opening, they'll try to squeeze something in that ordinarily wouldn't make it through. And it's perfectly true that I'm sure you're speaking for the majority of journalists who are trained, have it driven into their heads that this is a crusading profession, adversarial, we stand up against power, a very self-serving view. On the other hand, in my opinion, I hate to make a value judgment, but the better journalists, and in fact the ones who are often regarded as the best journalists, have quite a different picture, and I think a very realistic one.
How can you know that I'm self-censoring? How can you know that journalists
are self-censoring? I'm sure you believe everything you're saying. But what I'm saying is if you believe something different, you wouldn't be sitting where you're sitting.
And that's, I mean, I think that interaction right there, right? Like he walks through the components of propaganda. He walks through examples of it, and he walks through how people are placed in the media because they have certain views, because they are more accepted, and because the people who hire them want them to have those views, right? And I think that this is all important to keep in mind, right? When we talk about this next part. And I know that I'm going to come across maybe a little bit or a lot bit hyper fixating or hyper focusing on this, but I think this is actually kind of important. And it's that the New York Times posted this article by Ezra Klein, "Stop Acting Like This Is Normal." Unfortunately, I've had a lot of negative things to say about Ezra Klein, and I stand by everything I've said. However, Ezra Klein has the position he has because people want him to have it, because he has bosses who agree with what he says, because he has a lot of legitimacy in the establishment, right? And that communicates, right, something not just to an audience who reads Ezra Klein's work, but it also communicates to the people in power who generally want folks like Ezra Klein to be where they're at. You know, the Democratic establishment, left-leaning donors, etc. Ezra Klein is like a product of like the Obama era, right? Because he's a third-way neolib. I mean, essentially, yeah. He's been their tool to try and rebrand neoliberalism. And in that capacity, he's been very useful. However, I think that this is a really, really intriguing change. Stop acting like this is normal. And like he put out like this video and he goes through it, but we don't have to, I don't want to spend 18 minutes listening to him talk about this. But basically, you know, this came out 2 days ago, a day-ish ago. And yeah, I again don't trust Ezra Klein, comrade girl. Don't trust him. That's not the thrust of what I'm getting at here. The thrust of what I'm getting at here is that we are now at a point where we are coming up on potentially the last point of leverage in negotiations between now and 2026. This is not me talking about how, look, Ezra Klein is correct. The point I'm trying to get at is, what does it represent for Ezra Klein to be correct at this time? What does it mean for essentially an avatar of the neoliberal establishment order to be coming out and saying these things? And I think that it indicates that there is some level of awareness of the situation and of the existential threat that is currently hanging over not just like the left progressive movement, because we know if it was just the left progressives or the socialists or the communists at stake, that folks like Ezra Klein would cut the cable holding that boulder up instantly and let us all be crushed. Oh boy. I understand, Johnny Ramo, that you have a dislike of Noam Chomsky. Also understand that whatever your dislikes of him and his associations with Epstein, I agree. Lost a lot of respect for him. But also, you got to stop ranting about it like pedophiles in my chat for obvious reasons. Because I'm aware of that, but the point of showing that Noam Chomsky clip is that he's also like a really smart guy, and manufacturing consent is like one of those things that he absolutely nails. Like I'm not worshiping, I'm talking about one of his most influential ideas that has influenced many people after that. Man, it's so difficult sometimes to do this show. This is a long and established thing that happens in our media. And the reason I'm using Noam Chomsky is because he's very articulate and he is the one who wrote an entire book about it. Like, there are a lot of things we can criticize different historical thinkers for, and rightly so. But like, please stop like fixating on the aspects that like I don't agree with, and like follow me on this train of thought. You know? Like I'd appreciate that. Do it as a favor for me, please. Because, like, I'd like to talk about the broader thrust of our current fascist moment and, like, how this relates to our current political situation. Noam Chomsky, like, bad on Ukraine, bad on like the Cambodian genocide. Yes, he has bad ideas too, and abhorrent ones even. But like, that's not what we're talking about right now. We're talking about the idea that he is in fact correct on this point. That being said, let's get back to this, right? Because Ezra Klein, as an avatar of this neoliberal establishment, someone who has been, groomed for this role and to kind of be the voice of these rich, out of touch political elite, economic elite, etc. Putting this out there is actually really important because we are on the verge of a gigantic showdown this month. And this story comes out a handful of days after a leaked proposal from Hakeem Jeffries and Chuck Schumer to basically give up all leverage. And I talked about this a couple days ago, but to give up all leverage in negotiation during this budget showdown that's coming at the end of this month. Because if there is not a budget passed by the end of this month, the government shuts down. Okay? So what ends up happening here is that Chuck Schumer put out this proposal, and it's essentially, hey, yeah, two dads smooching. It's because earlier this year, Chuck Schumer kicked that can down the road. That bill's coming due. So what's happening now is that Chuck Schumer is putting out a proposal that's essentially, we will give Republicans everything they want if they approve Medicare, Obamacare subsidies through the end of 2026, right? So that is, I would argue, a complete and utter dereliction of duty, a complete and utter failure of the American people and of our political system, if that is what the actual offer on the table is, and that is what they choose to go with. Now, negotiations are still ongoing, okay? Negotiations are still ongoing. And so that's why it's important here that Ezra Klein puts out something like this. Stop acting like this is normal. Because a lot of this is about how we got here and what is at stake in this budget showdown, right? So in about 3 weeks, the government's funding will run out. Democrats will face a choice. Join Republicans to fund a government that President Trump is turning into a tool of authoritarian takeover and vengeance, or shut the government down. Democrats faced a version of this choice back in March. DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, was chainsawing its way through the government. Civil servants were being fired left and right. Government grants and payments were being choked off and reworked into tools of political power and punishment. Trump was signing executive orders demanding the investigation, I would say the persecution, of his enemies. He had announced shocking tariffs on Mexico and Canada. We were in the muzzle velocity stage of this presidency, and Democrats seemed completely overwhelmed and outmatched. I often heard people complain that Democrats lacked a message. What Democrats really lacked was power. They didn't have the House or the Senate, but they did have one sliver of leverage: to fund the government. Senate Republicans needed Democratic votes, and not just one or two. They needed at least 7 Democrats to reach that magic 60-vote threshold. House Democrats wanted a shutdown, but Chuck Schumer, the leader of the Senate Democrats, didn't. He voted for the funding bill and encouraged a crucial number of his colleagues to do the same, and the bill passed. To many Democrats, this seemed insane. Some began openly calling for Schumer to resign or face a primary challenge. This was Democrats' first real opportunity to fight back against Trump, and they had folded. What were they good for? During this period, I talked to Schumer, to House leadership, to members of Congress with different theories of what should be done. I didn't think it was an easy call. The House's argument, Hakeem Jeffries' argument, was that a shutdown creates a crisis creates attention, and attention gives Democrats the chance to make their case to be heard by the American people. One of the weird scenarios where, like, Hakeem Jeffries actually had a good plan. One of the freak scenarios I've heard of. The argument Schumer made was threefold. First, Trump was being stopped in the courts. There were dozens of cases playing out against him. He was losing again and again and again and again. Shut down the government, you might shut down the courts. Second, DOGE was trying to gut the executive branch. When the government falls into a funding crisis, the executive gets more authority to decide where the money the government does have goes. In that chaos, DOGE could go further and faster. After all, it's the Democrats who want the government to work. It was Trump and Doge looking for every opportunity to dismantle it. A shutdown wasn't leverage against Trump. It was leverage against the Democrats' own priorities. And third, the market was quaking at the threat of Trump's tariffs. Trump had promised a strong economy and low prices, and instead he was creating chaos. If Democrats triggered a shutdown at the exact moment Trump was creating an economic crisis, they would confuse who to blame for the chaos. Was it Trump or them? It's the first rule of politics. When your opponents are drowning, do not throw them a lifeline. And I thought there was a fourth argument. Democrats had not prepared for a shutdown. They had not explained why they were shutting the government down or what they wanted to achieve. They had no strategy. They had no message. The demand I was hearing them make was that the spending bill needed more bipartisan negotiation. It was unbearably lame. Let's see. If you had forced me to choose, I would have said Schumer was probably right. It wasn't the time for a shutdown, in part because Democrats weren't prepared to win one. But the bill that passed back in March funding the government runs out at the end of this month. So we're facing the question again. Should Senate Democrats partner with Senate Republicans to fund this government? I don't see how they can. And this is, again, we're in a weird moment. We're in a weird moment where this Obama guy, this establishment avatar, is saying, yeah, we need to shut down the government. Yeah, exactly, Dragonfly. One of the most centrist people in my county party got up at tonight's meeting and demanded everyone write to senators/reps and tell them not to fold. Okay? And this is, I mean, this is playing out across the board, right? And this is a sign that perhaps the wind is blowing in our direction. Okay? It is... What needs to happen, guys, is that the government needs to be shut down. And some very large asks need to be made, because we are in a time of authoritarian... We're in an authoritarian moment. There is a desire and a drive within the Trump administration to drive us towards that authoritarianism, to compromise our democracy, to rip apart established norms and make them worse. Right? And this is all really, really important because, guys, we need to make demands. We need to demand, for example, that like trans rights aren't compromised in the budget bill. We need to demand an end to the occupation of U.S. cities by military forces. We need to demand a restoration of Medicaid funding. We need to demand like so many. There needs to be a clear list of demands, and that list of demands needs to be communicated not just to the Trump administration, but to the entirety of the American people. This is like a make or break moment. This is a time when, like, you know, like Martin Luther with the theses nailed to the church door. We need to do the same with our demands to keep the government open. Those aren't even big asks. They're not even big asks. But they are important asks, right? Is it time for a general strike? It's always time for a general strike. The issue is that general strikes take a long time to organize because people need to be able to live through the general strike. And you need to be able to organize and coordinate one. And that takes way more organization than we currently have. I have to beg you guys every show multiple times to join your local Dems and join your local DSA. And like, if I can't even get you guys to go do that, I'm not going to be able to get you guys to like throw away your ability to like buy food and like pay your rent, you know? Like that's kind of the thing, right? I ask you guys to go to the meetings so that like we can go and do more beyond that, right? But there are a number of things that we need, right? We need Medicaid restored. We need an end to the occupation in American cities. We need, like, frankly, we need guarantees that the administration will follow the Constitution and the rule of law. We need a repeal of the tariffs. We need an end to, like, what has made Trump able to do these tariffs. And we're not going to be able to get all of those things, just as an FYI, but we need to demand them. And we need to get them. Yeah, we need to end rescissions from the executive. We need to restore funding that has been appropriated by Congress. We need to do a number of different things. And they're all really big. Oh, the tariffs are back on? LB, like, oh man, LB. Let me just throw this up there real quick. Postal traffic to the United States drops over 80% after trade exemption rule ends, UN agency says. This is from yesterday, guys. Like, the tariffs and the changes to, like, how things can be brought into the country have cost 80% of all postal traffic coming into the country. Like, there needs to, like, again, there needs to be demands. There needs to be demands to restore core elements, and it needs to be understood generally among the American population what the demands are and why they're being made. You know, it's not enough to just like, oh, well, the government's shut down. It looks like the Dems are doing it. The answer the Dems have should be, yes, we are fighting for your healthcare. We are fighting for your ability to get packages. We're fighting for your ability to not just be taxed unilaterally by like a despot. We are fighting for your ability to like have constitutional rights. We are fighting for your ability to not be occupied by a military in your own country. Okay? That needs to be the demand, and anything less than those kinds of demands and that kind of a spine is a capitulation. This is, again, one of the last ways we are going to have to make this country not shit for millions of people, tens of millions of people. And we need to take that opportunity. And Val Draper, it might be that the Dems don't meet this moment. But the point I'm trying to make here is that the fact that, like, we've got Ezra Klein making the argument that Dems do need to show this backbone and cannot afford to simply roll over for a handful of pittance, that's a sign that there are people in the establishment that are giving more serious thoughts to a government shutdown than there were last time. All I'm saying here is that there is a desperate need for us to organize around this if we want to avoid the misery and death of many, many people. Untold millions in this country. And you guys have an opportunity to exert some level of influence over what direction this country goes. Because there is a lot of time between right now, September 9th, and the end of this month. And what I want all of you to do, and what I'm asking all of you to do here, is to head over to 5calls.org, and I want you guys to commit to calling your senators. And very specifically, call your senators with those demands. Okay? Call your senators every day. Leave voicemails every day between now and the end of the month, because we need to make it clear that what we want is an end to the occupation, an end to the rescissions, an end to tariffs, an end to Medicaid cuts. We need to make it clear that we need these things and we need them to shut the government down. Okay? Shut the government down. My senator is a Republican. Call him anyway, because this is something that they might break on. Who can say? And also tell him to eat shit. Because, guys, again, this is outside of the 2026 election, and like getting involved in your local primaries, in your local races. This is kind of the big point of leverage we have. This is the point of leverage we have. So what I'm asking you to do is to keep those in mind. End the Medicaid cuts, protect Medicaid, end the tariff regime, end the rescissions, end the occupation. Okay? Those are what is at stake in these negotiations, and we need them to know as many people as possible are paying attention and rely on them to actually fight. So I'm asking you to get to do the calls, write letters if you feel inclined to do that. And also try and get other people in your life who feel as strongly as you do to also call and also write letters. Because we need that level of organization. If Ezra Klein, a centrist neoliberal shill who has been groomed for his position as an avatar of the neoliberal establishment, who has been involved in manufacturing consent, and also folks like Josh Marshall over at Talking Points Memo are coming out there and explaining this clearly, that we need demands. There is a chance that your calls could punch above their weight. There's a chance that we can actually motivate Dems to fight. And we need them to fight. And we need them to make demands. And we need them to actually win. Okay? We need them to actually fucking win on these issues. Your life might depend on it. The lives of your neighbors might depend on it. We need to make it happen. So I'm asking, you find folks who are watching live, and I'm also asking the folks who are going to watch this not live, please do this. Is there a particular time that is best to call? Bagel Lady Scum, thank you for asking. If you want to talk to a real person, calling during, business hours is best. However, you can also leave voicemails. And either way, make sure you give your zip code. Make sure they are, Bag Lady, sorry. Give your zip code so they know you're a constituent. Give your name and explain, what issue you are calling about. And it helps to talk about a different issue each day. That's why it's called 5 calls. The website that I linked. Because you want to make 5 calls. In order to maximize your impact with calls, talking about a different issue each day will maximize the effectiveness of your calls. Because how this works in all of these offices is that generally some person or some small team is manning phones. They take your call or they listen to the voicemail. They note down what the call was about and who it came from. But they only note down what the call was about. They get X number of calls about healthcare or something, right? If you call back the next day talking about healthcare, that still only counts as 1 call in their note taking, right? So you need to do a different topic to maximize how your calls get tallied up by the system. I know it's stupid. I know it's weird. But if you can ask for, an end, stand up strong for us, and don't cave, use the leverage, and end the occupation of American cities. That can be one day. Use your leverage and don't cave, and fight for Medicaid. Demand Medicaid in your negotiations. That can be another one, right? So there's a way to do this to maximize your effectiveness, but if you can't remember to do that, just remember calling multiple times is better than not calling at all. If you have social anxiety, you can in fact call them after hours, late at night, and leave voicemails. That is also acceptable. In fact, you could call them right now. Yes, call your senators too. That it is important to note, call your senators, because we do not have this leverage in the House. We only have this leverage in the Senate. So, that being said, we all need to do our part and chip in and do this, okay? And if enough of us pitch in, if enough of us get together and do this, we have a shot. So don't give up and keep fucking fighting. And like, comment, and subscribe, because my editor tells me I should say that in segments, and I'm really bad at remembering until the very end, and now it's kind of awkward because I shoved it in right at the end.
Riverboat Jack is coming to town. All the viewers gather round. Twitch and YouTube is where she streams. All that content is bursting the seams. Politics, dating, plenty more. Her sense of fashion you'll adore. So grab your stuff and hop aboard. We're going straight to Jack's Discord. Riverboat Jack.